A very warm welcome to everyone. Welcome everyone from wherever you may be joining us. We're very pleased to have you with us for our virtual discussion, which is called Courage and Compassion, Jewish Resistance in Nazi-occupied Belgium. Today's discussion is organized by the Holocaust and the United Nations Outreach Program, which is part of the Department of Global Communications at the United Nations. My name is Tracy Peterson, and I manage the Holocaust and the United Nations Outreach Program. Just a few housekeeping matters. We are recording today's program, and we will share the recording with anyone who has registered. I want to ask you, please, if you have questions, that you kindly put them into the questions for the panel into the Q&A section. And we have set aside time towards the end of the program for us to be able to answer these questions. And the questions we don't get to, we will share with the speakers and we will get the answers back to you. Now, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our colleague, Ms. Sherry Aldous, who is the Director of the United Nations Regional Information Center in Brussels. Sherry has more than 30 years of experience in communications in both the private sector and the United Nations, including managing multinational teams and leading strategic communications, as well as creative outreach to a variety of global audiences. Her extensive experience includes building high-level partnerships with member states, civil society, the private sector, academia, and international institutions such as the European Union. It is absolutely pleasure to have Ms. Aldous with us and delighted that Sherry will moderate today's discussion. She joins us from the office in Brussels, and so good afternoon, Sherry. Over to you.
Tracy, thank you so much, and welcome, a very warm welcome to everybody online, and gratitude to everybody for being with us today for this important conversation. So as Tracy said, my name is Sherry Aldous, and I'm the director of the UN Regional Information Center in Brussels, which is very relevant to the topic that we'll be discussing today. And I look after UN communications for the 22 countries and 13 languages in Western Europe. So I am particularly pleased to moderate today's discussion on the topic of Jewish resistance in Nazi-occupied Belgium. Many members of the Jewish resistance in Belgium were targets of Nazi persecution themselves. And despite the constant threat of arrest, imprisonment, and execution, they took bold actions to defy Nazi dehumanization and protect lives. Today, we'll discuss their notable efforts, ranging from espionage, clandestine press, armed resistance, to hiding and rescue networks. The courage and the compassion of the resistance exemplified a deep commitment to humanity and justice, reminding us that even in the darkest times, individual and collective actions can protect the vulnerable and pave the way for a more just and compassionate society, which is a message that we still need very, very much today. So it is my great pleasure to welcome our esteemed speakers this afternoon. We have Dr. Yaniv Stamberger, Ms. Doreen Stiven, and Dr. Noémie Perelmel-Matisse, who will join us online. But to start with, we will open with His Excellency, Ambassador Philippe Kridelka, who is the permanent representative of Belgium to the United Nations, and we are very honored and pleased to have you with us today. Thank you, Ambassador, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Madame Aldis. Thank you for your introduction, and I would like to say good morning or good afternoon to you, colleagues, friends. It is an honor for me to address you at the beginning of this virtual discussion that will shed light on the Jewish resistance in Nazi-occupied Belgium. I sincerely thank the UN Holocaust Outreach Program for organizing this key event and for having invited me. The value of Holocaust remembrance and Belgium's commitment to it cannot be exaggerated. We sincerely feel it is our duty, lest we forget the victims and the survivors. At the same time, we acknowledge that fostering education, remembrance, and research about what happened in the past is the only way to build a better future. In that regard, Belgium dearly values its membership in the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and we actively participate in its work. Perhaps lesser known, we equally value our membership of the International Commission, which supervises the work of the Arolsen Archives. These archives are an international center with the world's most comprehensive archive on the victims and survivors of the Nazi ideology. Its collection belongs to UNESCO's Memory of the World and is an important source of knowledge for society, for all our societies today. That is why during our presidency of the International Commission in 2021-2022, Belgium focused on digitalization, including the question of privacy. The closing plenary conference of our presidency, therefore, adopted regulations for personal data protection. Finally, friends and colleagues, I would like to recall our last collaboration with the UN Holocaust Outreach Program. In early 2023, last year, in the context of the International Holocaust Remembrance Day, we put on an exhibition facial images at the UN headquarters with a view to unmask the dangers of stereotypes. The Nazis and their racist collaborators used stereotyping, false images, disinformation, and conspiracy thinking to encourage hatred with deadly consequences. The exhibition exposed how false and manipulative imaging worked then and how it continues to find expression today. Anti-Semitism, unfortunately, is not dead. It challenged us, all of us, to take action to unmask the lies that continue to divide and polarize our world. To conclude, my country, Belgium, truly appreciated that opportunity to join efforts with the United Nations and, among others, with the Caserne d'Ossins, a Belgian memorial museum and research center on the Holocaust and human rights. The Caserne d'Ossins, the Dossin barracks, are in Mechelen in Belgium, and it's one of the places, I think the main place, where the Nazis concentrated the Jewish victims of the Holocaust before putting them on the train to go to the death camps. We are therefore incredibly pleased that a representative of this center, joined by a representative of the University of Antwerp and the Peace Center of the City of Antwerp, again collaborate with the United Nations on this most important issue. This is to remember the courage and compassion of those who defied the Nazis and their collaborators, despite the grave risk to their own lives. And with your permission, Madam Moderator, I just wanted to say a word about Professor Noémie Perelman, who will take the floor after me, to tell her if she listens to us after this meeting. I know that it is too early today. She lives in the western part of the US. It's too early to join us now, but she may listen to the discussions later on. And I just wanted her to know that the memory of her parents, Professor Chaim Perelman and her mother Fela Perelman, is not dead in Belgium, not at all. Her father, Professor Chaim Perelman, was a hero, not only for the resistance against the Nazis, but is also one of the greatest European philosophers of the 20th century. And it's some comfort for us to think that heroes are not completely dead as long as their ideas keep circulating. I was talking this morning with a diplomatic advisor to our king. He studied at the University of Brussels, and he studied the books of Chaim Perelman, and he uses some of those arguments and the points that Professor Perelman made about argumentation and others in his daily life. So I just wanted to share that with Professor Noé Perelman-Matisse if she listens to us later. Thank you very much.
Ambassador Koudelka, thank you so much, and I very much appreciate. I'm sure that Dr. Perelman-Matisse will appreciate the words that you have, especially for her. And we will now, as you mentioned, listen to a very special video message from Dr. Noémie Perelman-Matisse. She is a retired psychologist, indeed in Salt Lake City, Utah, and she specializes in the treatment of adult survivors of childhood trauma. Dr. Matisse was also one of the hidden children and students of Nos Petits Kindergarten, which was created by her mother, Fela Perelman, to hide and provide education for Jewish children that the Nazis forbade from attending school with children who were not Jewish. And so it is really my great pleasure to introduce the recorded remarks by Dr. Noémie Perelman-Matisse. Thank you.
I have been invited to participate in this program because I was a hidden child in Belgium during World War II. I am the daughter of Fella and Chaim Perelman, who were major figures in the Jewish resistance. My father was a co-founder of the Comité de Défense des Juifs, a Jewish defense committee, which was indeed created in our house. Jews who were Belgian citizens were not targeted by the Nazis at the beginning of the occupation. My parents were both born in Poland, but they were naturalized Belgian citizens. They might have been safe for a while, but for their resistance activities. And my mother wanted to protect me. She asked the Forani couple, who had 2 little girls, to take me into their home. Thus, I was probably the first hidden child in Belgium. My stay with the Foranis was cut short after a visitor to their home asked me, "Do you come here often?" And I answered, "I live here. I'm a Jewish child in hiding." My mother was told of this and decided to take me out of the Forani home. She feared that the funny story would travel and might be heard by the wrong person. My next foster family was the Blake's family, who lived right next door. The Blakes were very poor. They didn't even have indoor plumbing, but they were very big in generosity. And they took me into their home. Their son actually gave me his little mansard bedroom and slept in the room with his parents while I was there. A while later, I was expelled from kindergarten. The Germans had decreed that Jewish children could no longer go to school with Gentile children. As I needed a school, my mother created a school, the school known as Nos Petits, or Little Ones. She hired the teachers, found the locale, and even convinced the Brussels authorities that they had a mandate to provide a streetcar to transport the children. I started first grade at Nos Petits. Alas, that school had to be closed after a few months, and here's the story. A Jewish couple had been arrested, but they protested that they could not leave without their child. The Gestapo came to fetch the child at the school. None of them were ever heard from again. Now the Gestapo was alerted to the school and came back to arrest a couple of the teachers. So my mother decided that the school needed to be closed. The natural instinct of a parent who wants to protect a child is to pull her closer. My mother understood that to save her child, you had to send her away. Collaborationists might denounce adults, but few would stoop so low as to denounce a child. As the school was closing, my mother spoke privately with each of the other mothers, and she told them, I can't tell you what to do, but I have put my child in another home. If you want to do the same and you don't have any place where to put the child, we will help you. My mother started to place the children with the help of one young assistant, Jeanne Damon. Jeanne was not Jewish. She was a preschool teacher somewhere from the countryside. And she was referred to my mother after she asked around for a way to join the resistance. The children found homes through the Catholic priest of Fellen, a village in the Ardennes. As the program to place the children became more and more time-consuming, it was spinned off by the CDJ, the Comité de Défense des Juifs, to a larger group of social workers under the direction of Yvonne Jospin. My mother found another school for me, a progressive school directed by Amélie Ahmed, who did accept a few Jewish children under assumed names. Miss Ahmed also arranged for me to find shelter with one of her best teachers, Lucie Monnier, and her mother, Louise. Lucie and Louise had a wonderful dog, a Malinois, called Celt. And they had arranged when I came to close off a room to prevent the dog from attacking the intruder. But I was an impetuous child, so I just ran to the dog and started petting him, and he started licking me, and we were bonded at that moment. Celt was a shepherd, and I became his flock. And for the rest of the time, for the next 2 years, he kept watch over me. He watched me go to school. He protected me, and if anybody had wanted to hurt me, they would have had to kill that dog. I spent 2 years with Lucie and Louise Monnier. I owe them not only my life, but my sanity. I've heard or read the stories of many other hidden children, and I consider myself very lucky. I was not locked in the closet as some were in other countries. I went to school. Of course, I did not have play dates. I could have blown my cover. I was loved. Discipline was never harsh. Like my parents, Lucie and Louise were not religious, and I was not forcibly converted to Christianity. Lucie told me often that the Jews were a great people, that the Nazis would be vanquished, and that I should have pride in my identity. Lastly, when liberation came, Lucie and Louise did not try to hang on to me and create conflicting allegiances. Lucie was a teacher. She knew how to love and let go. The home I returned to was filled with children whom my mother had rescued from refugee camps. She was busy setting up orphanages for the children whose parents had not returned. She was inspired to hire as counselors young people returning from camps who would share with the children the silent language of trauma. They formed a new family. She also hired piano and violin teachers. She said, "These are Jewish children, they have to have music lessons." Mother and I never spoke of our separation. She also did not speak of what had happened to her parents, 3 siblings, and most of her extended family who had remained in Poland. After my mother passed away, when I was going through her belongings, I found a folder way in the back of her desk. It included postcards addressed to me for my 5th birthday by my grandmother, my grandfather, and my Aunt Marilka. This was days before they were deported. The postcards had been mailed from the large ghetto, written in German, the language of the enemy, the only language allowed, as everything had to go through censorship. Each card bore a stamp of Hitler. The text was anodyne, wishing me a good life. I saw these cards 50 years after they were written. I was a grandmother by then. These postcards from the grave hit me like a bolt from the sky. For the first time, it all became real. These people were not abstractions. They were my family. I was the only grandchild they would ever know about. They loved me. In their dying days, they loved me.
Thank you very much, Dr. Matisse, for your deeply touching message that offered us a glimpse of the remarkable work of the Jewish Belgian resistance, and in particular, the courage of your parents. For all of us, I think, who are parents ourselves, children, grandchildren, grandparents, this is such a moving tribute to them and gives us real insight into the impossible choices and the bravery of families at that time. We would like to dive deeper into this topic now, and so it is my pleasure to turn to our panelists today, Dr. Yaniv Stamberger and Ms. Doreen Stuyven. Dr. Yaniv Stamberger is the coordinator of the Peace Center of the City of Antwerp and an affiliated researcher at the Institute of Jewish Studies at the University of Antwerp. He obtained his PhD in history at the University of Antwerp and the Université Libre de Bruxelles, for which he received the Monseigneur Charles de Clercq and Pro Civitate Prize from the Royal Flemish Academy of Belgium for Science and the Arts. Dr. Stamberger's research focuses on Jewish life in Belgium at the end of the 19th and first half of the 20th century, and he is the author of numerous articles and chapters on the subject. We also have Ms. Doreen Stuyven, who obtained a master's degree in history at the KU Leuven and an advanced master in archival science at the Vrije Universiteit Brussels. She is affiliated with Kazerne Dossen, the Memorial Museum and Research Center on Holocaust and Human Rights in Mechelen, Belgium, since 2010. As of 2019, she manages all aspects of archival curation, as well as the Give Them a Face commemoration project. Ms. Stuyven represents Kazerne Dossen within the European Holocaust Research Infrastructure and the Archive and Contemporary Records Board of the Flemish Association for Library, Archive and Documentation. She also co-chairs the Working Group on Sustainable Publishing of Metadata within the Digital Research Infrastructure for the Arts and Humanities, and her research focuses on hiding in Belgium and on the impact of the General Data Protection Regulation on Holocaust remembrance. I'm very happy to discuss this very important topic with the two of you today. We will have an opportunity, as Tracy mentioned, to open up to some questions at the end of our conversation. And I think that I would like to start with Dr. Stamberger, with Yaniv, to perhaps tell us about how you define Jewish resistance and how does Jewish resistance distinguish itself from resistance or resistance activities among non-Jewish Belgians. So Yaniv, I would like to give you the floor, and I see you are sharing your screen. Perfect. Over to you.
Thank you very much for having us today. As to your question, well, Jewish resistance, first of all, is very context dependent. What constituted Jewish resistance in Belgium or Holland, for instance, or Western Europe more broadly is very different than Jewish resistance as it happened in Eastern Europe. In Eastern Europe, with its large Jewish population, captive in ghettos, and a more aggressive and far more pervasive anti-Jewish persecution, Jewish resistance would happen in larger resistance group, which defined themselves as Jewish and also consisted mostly of Jewish members. In Belgium, for instance, Jews individually or in smaller groups joined Belgium resistant movement. For instance, if we see here on the right, we see Alexandre Gourary on the very far right of this picture, with his non-Jewish comrades of the Mouvement National Belge. Alexandre Gourary was born in Odessa, immigrated to Belgium in 1937, where he joined Betar, Zionist revisionist youth movement, and later during the occupation joined the Mouvement National Belge, and among other things helped liberate the port of Antwerp, which in this picture we see the aftermath of. As to the broader question, how can we compare Jewish resistance with resistance activities of non-Jewish Belgians? Well, of course, the Jewish persecution plays a very important role in what defines Jewish resistance and how we can understand it. Because of their targeting, other activities also can be counted as resistance. For instance, the historian, the great Holocaust historian Yehuda Bauer, who recently passed away, defined resistance, Jewish resistance, as resistance to the Nazis included not only physical resistance, but further any activity that gave the Jewish people dignity and humanity under the most humiliating and inhuman conditions. So, for instance, refusing to wear a yellow star can be considered in that case as part of a form of Jewish resistance from a more moral perspective. So that's a short answer to your question.
Thank you very much, Yaniv. I think that we would like to pass the floor now to Ms. Stuyven, to Doreen, perhaps to give us an idea of the size of the Jewish resistance in Belgium at the time.
Yes, thank you, Sherry. So Yaniv and I, with our research, set out to give an answer to some basic questions like how many Jewish persons from Belgium were in the resistance, because this was actually not very well known or very well researched. We know the stories like the incredible story of Dr. Perelman's parents, but how many were there in fact? So we did a lot of research on the subject. We looked into a lot of cases. And of course, we first set out how big was the Jewish population and how big was the non-Jewish population. So you can see that in Belgium, the Jewish population was rather small. About 56,000 Jewish men, women, and children were living in Belgium during the war. And if you look at the number of resistance fighters that we found 1,164. So about 2% of all Jewish persons living in Belgium during the war were in the resistance. If you look at the non-Jewish population in Belgium, it's a little bit beneath 2% of the non-Jewish population, but we can see that compared to the size of both communities, the presence and the resistance of both groups was comparable in size, which was very interesting to us because we were not aware of this fact. We also found some very interesting other things. For example, when we dove into these 1,164 cases of Jewish men and women who were recognized after the war as resistance fighters by the Belgian government, we found out, and this is a division of recognized Jewish resistance fighters who belong to the armed resistance movements, that they were actually, the Jewish community was represented in every big armed resistance network in Belgium. We were well aware of the fact that Jewish resistance fighters were present in the more communist armed resistance movements like the patriotic militias or the armed partisans, but we can even find Jewish resistance fighters in more conservative and even right-wing military armed resistance movements in Belgium. So we see a broad scope of Jewish presence in all types of armed resistance networks, which was also very interesting because we could see that they pertain to a lot of different organizations with a lot of different political, ethical, and social orientations. A third interesting fact that we found in the 1,164 files that we checked is there is this story in Belgium that Jewish persons were less recognized after the war by the Belgian government as resistance fighters because they were foreigners, that foreigners had to fight harder to be recognized as resistance fighters in Belgium after the war. But we looked into the countries of birth of these 1,164 Jewish men and women that were recognized, and we can see that over half of them is actually born in Poland. So this is by far the largest group amongst the Jewish resistance fighters. And this statistics right here shows the country of birth of the people that we found, the 1,164, and it clearly reflects the structure of the Jewish community in Belgium, which was very diverse in 1940, which held over 60 different nationalities. So actually, the resistance fighters very well reflect the Jewish community as a whole. And last but not least, we were also surprised to find that if we look at non-Jewish resistance fighters recognized in Belgium, only 1 in 10 was a woman. But if we go and look at the files of the recognized Jewish resistance fighters, 1 in 4 is a woman, which shows that women are really strongly represented in the Jewish resistance in Belgium, which was very interesting because, of course, we thought that both groups would be similar, but that did not turn out to be the case.
Thank you, Doreen. I mean, that begs the question. That's a really fascinating data point. I would really appreciate it if we could do a deeper dive into that, if you have any ideas or explanations as to why that is the case.
So there are many hypotheses, and Yaniv and I really tried to lay the groundwork, which means that we did statistical analysis from which we tried to derive interesting observations for other researchers to continue on. So the information that we gathered on the Jewish women in the resistance might have several explanations. We did not really have the time to go into the why in detail, but what we can see is that there's a certain activism amongst Jewish women in Belgium. Belgium is a country of Jewish immigration, where also Jewish refugees found shelter, especially as of the 1930s. And women moving from their country of birth, mainly in Eastern Europe, to Belgium, often by themselves, they had learned to take care of themselves and to stand up for themselves. So we have this, I wouldn't call it feminism, but strong female activism within the Jewish community, thanks to the experience they brought from their home countries and also their immigration. The photo that we see here, for example, is of a group of women that the Nazis sent from Antwerp to the eastern part of Belgium in 1940, for a reason we still don't know. So this group, these are all Czech female Jewish expelled persons. And many of them joined the communist resistance later on during the war. So these wartime experiences of them being expelled by the Nazis, being forcefully relocated by the Nazis, them coming into contact with other women in their circumstances, other Jewish women with certain beliefs, strongly convinced them to take actions later on during the war. An even better example is the Mädelarbeid. This is a group of young women, sometimes even teenagers of Austrian descent, who in an organized way, laid contact with German soldiers in Belgium to try to demoralize them, convince them to spread anti-Nazi propaganda. So these were really Jewish girls who, while risking their own life, tried to perform acts of sabotage by laying these contacts. So this female activism, and it really diverse doctoral research on its own, it's very interesting and it's very pertinent.
Thank you so much, Doreen. Hopefully somebody will dive into that even more, because that is a fascinating angle. Yaniv, you and Doreen have both done a lot of research, some of which you're sharing with us today, into this topic. I think it would be interesting for us to learn a little bit more about the methodology of that research. Maybe start with Yaniv and then over to Doreen.
Right. So first, as to the question why we wanted to do this research, why on the numbers, as Doreen already hinted at, in the Belgian public consciousness and also to a degree in academia, the Jewish experience of the Second World War has really been looked at through the prism of persecution and victimhood mostly, which in itself is very logical given the scale of the atrocities, but it leaves some gaps. So the the historiography of the Jewish resistance has been to a degree researched. In the 1980s, for instance, scholars such as Lucien and Maxim Steinberg have talked about the Jewish resistance in their wider studies on the Jewish persecution of in Belgium during the Second World War. But this research has been largely descriptive, telling the stories, telling the facts, and painting a broad picture. What really has been missing is the use of quantitative and statistical methods, which really can ground Jewish resistance in Belgium. How many, what, and this is why Doreen and I started on this recent research we did on Jewish statistical and quantitative methods in the history of the research of Belgian Jewish resistance. So Doreen, perhaps you can elaborate on that.
So it was definitely not an easy task, because there's no such thing as a database with all resistance fighters in Belgium. That does not exist. So we had to really dive into other sources. Luckily for us, many of our colleagues at the federal institutions in Belgium had partial databases. For example, there is a database with all resistance fighters in Belgium that were recognized because they performed some acts of espionage, for example. And there is a database that exists in the federal institutions of all people that were recognized as civil resistance fighters because they, for example, created false identity papers or they helped people in hiding. And there's also a database for people who were recognized as resistance fighters because they had been active in the illegal press. So there are several databases for some groups of the resistance fighters. Fortunately, the largest group of resistance fighters are the armed resistance fighters. It's about 150,000 people, and there's no database. So we really had to go to the organizations themselves, branches of the different armed resistance organizations, which are also part of the graph that I just showed. We went to their offices, we went to the Belgian military, we went to some of the federal institutions, and we really had to go through tens of thousands of index cards, files. And that's how we drafted a database with resistance fighters. And then we looked into which of them was Jewish. And for those that were Jewish, we then were able to pinpoint 1,164 definitely Jewish resistance fighters that were recognized by the Belgian state as resistance fighters after the war. So as Yaniv said, these are recognized people who were active in the resistance, but because we based ourselves on people that were recognized, there's undoubtedly hundreds or even thousands of people that did not make our database because they fall under Yehuda Bauer's concept of Amidah, so that performed acts of courage and acts of resistance that unfortunately the Belgian authorities did not recognize as an act of resistance after the war.
Thank you both for that, really the overview of the wider context of Jewish resistance. I think that you also both have some more personal stories of examples of people who have contributed to different types of resistance. Could you please share some of those with us? I think that we'd really like to hear some of these personal stories. Doreen, perhaps you can start. Thank you.
Okay, not a problem. One of the most known acts of resistance, of course, and Mrs. Dr. Perelman Matisse is the best example of it, is Jews helping Jews and creating networks for hiding. The biggest network in Belgium active during the war to hide Jews was a Jewish initiative. It was the Comité de Défense des Juifs, or the CDJ as we call it. Mrs. Perelman, Dr. Perelman Matisse's parents were members, but amongst the 8 founding members, 7 of them were Jews. So it's really a Jewish organized, a Jewish aspired network. They did a lot of things. They placed over 2,000 Jewish children in hiding. They helped about 5,000 Jewish adults by giving them food, giving them hiding place, giving them false papers. They also had their own service to create false identity papers. So it's a very active network that was all over Belgium. So there was a national coverage. There were agencies of the CDJ in Brussels, Antwerp, Liège, Charleroi, and they worked together with existing networks in other places such as Louvain and Namur. Here on this photo, you can see in the back the 3 adults. That's some of the collaborators of the CDJ. It's Abraham Van Aster on the left, who was a very religious man from Antwerp who did a lot of rescue work for the CDJ in Antwerp. And then in the middle, we have André Golin, and on the right, we have Ida Sterno, who were responsible for transporting Jewish children from their families in Brussels to hiding networks all over the country. So the network was very self-sufficient, and the staff was both Jewish and non-Jewish with a strong Jewish presence. So if we would have to name one network, resistance network in Belgium, that we could identify as truly Jewish, it would be the CDJ.
To jump in, another type of Jewish resistance was the clandestine press. So all over Belgium, underground papers and periodicals started to appear, including among the Jewish population. Early in the war, an early example of a resistance paper with a large Jewish presence is Het Vrije Woord, which was published by Henry Mandel, a Jewish Trotzkite. This paper appeared early in the war, really early, first in Antwerp, and later when it became too dodgy in Antwerp, it moved to Brussels in 1942, in the summer of 1942. Also, from 1941, Yiddish papers started to appear. Unser Woord from the Left Coalition, connected to the CDG, and Unser Stimme, a communist, later it appeared less, but also Dutch, De Vrije Gedachte, Le Flambeau, were also Jewish printed periodicals. One person who was instrumental in the Jewish press in Belgium is Abu Schwerber, whose photograph you see here. He was born in a religious family in Radom in Poland. As so many Jews in Belgium, he was an immigrant. He immigrated in Belgium in 1929 and became active in the Labour Zionist Party, Linke Coalition, a working class revolutionary party in Belgium. There he met his wife, Shifra Trotsky-Musnicki, and during the war he became the leader of the Linke Coalition. The Linke Coalition was one of the parties which also became active in the CDG. Abu Schwerber would play a prominent role in, was one of the founding members of the CDG. And the party also became active in aid organizations such as Gegenseitige Hilfe, but also in clandestine press. So Unser Stimme was edited by Abu Schwerber. It first appeared in December 1941, and it appeared, 28 editions appeared until the liberation of Brussels. So for a really long period, it lifted the morale of the Jewish people, provided information, published anti-German propaganda, which, as many Jews were in hiding, elevated their spirits. They needed information. So the clandestine press is another nice example of a form of resistance activity where Jews in Belgium were also very active and present. Another example, which is linked to the previous case, is the saving of Jewish heritage. It might perhaps at first glance not seem as a resistance activity, but lots of you will know famous cases in Eastern Europe, such as Emanuel Ringelblum and Oyneg Shabbos in the Warsaw Ghetto. But perhaps more interestingly for us is the paper brigade in the Vilnius Ghetto. Among them, one of the leaders of there was Abraham Sutzkever. Now, the paper brigade in Vilnius was a resistance activity group which tried to save the YIVO archives in Vilnius. The YIVO archives was established in 1925 and aimed to collect all types of documents about Eastern Jewish culture. It had millions of books, archives, records about Jewish life in Eastern Europe. During the war, first under Soviet occupation, the YIVO institution could live on, but during the German occupation, it became part of a systematic pillage by the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, which was tasked with looting art, both in Jewish and non-Jewish context. And this paper brigade and Abraham Sutzkever was able to hide and manage to smuggle out parts of the archive which then were smuggled later in the Soviet Union period to New York, where YIVO was re-established in 1940. There is an interesting link with the Belgian case, and there the figure of David Dode Trotsky is really important. Dode Trotsky was also the brother-in-law of Abush Werber, who we saw previously. His brother Shifra married Abush, was also a member of the Linke Coalition. He was born in Vilnius, moved to Belgium to study at Ghent University in the 1920s, and really became active in the Linke Coalition, but more as a cultural activist. For YIVO in Vilnius, he gathered information about Belgium's Eastern European Jewish immigrant community. In a technical term, he is called a Zamler. So in Belgium, there was a Friends Society of Friends of YIVO Society who collected information and archives, newspapers, pamphlets of Belgium's Jewish community. And Dode Trotsky from 1929 to 1939 managed to collect thousands of documents. During the war, he would become an active resistance member in Abush Werber's group. He was part also of the clandestine press they printed. But also he managed to secure this archive, because also the Rosenberg task force in Belgium also pillaged Jewish heritage, Jewish archives. Around 150 collections in Belgium were pillaged, and some 150,000 publications were sent off and shipped to Germany. Among the archives which were pillaged were those of the Zionist Federation of Belgium. The Consistoire, also part of the collection, was pillaged. But the collection that Trotsky managed to survive the war because he hid it in his apartment. He himself, however, was arrested in 1944 in July, and then deported to Auschwitz. And in 1945 in March, he perished in Camp Ebensee, a sub-camp of Mauthausen in Austria. But his collection remains to this day in New York, and is one of the most important collections about Jewish history in Belgium during the interwar period. It's invaluable for everyone who studies this subject.
Of course, apart from the hiding, the clandestine press, and the salvaging Jewish heritage, we also have armed resistance, in which the Jewish community was also very well represented, as we already saw. Many of the Jewish people who entered the Jewish armed resistance were members of the MOE. The MOE are the Main d'œuvre immigrés, so groups of immigrants that were active within the Communist Party in Belgium. And they were organized via nationality or ethnicity, if you wish. So there was a Yiddish division, a Hungarian division, a Bessarabian division. And during the war, these groups reoriented towards the organized armed resistance. Especially in Brussels, there was a mobile brigade of armed partisans. It was led by a Bulgarian non-Jewish man, Theodor Angelov, but he led a group of over 20 Jewish armed resistance fighters. In Antwerp, there were small groups of Jewish armed resistance fighters active. The most successful one was the one of the man we see on the right. This is a family photo. It's the Helfgott family from Antwerp. So the widowed mother and her 4 adult sons. The second from the right in the army uniform, his name is Israel Helfgott. During the war, he led the one and only fully Jewish cell of the armed resistance in Antwerp. Unfortunately, so his group was responsible for blowing up bridges, eliminating snitches, killing collaborators. Unfortunately, Israel Helfgott himself was also killed during an attempt to shoot a Flemish collaborator that was at the end of April 1943. His 3 brothers were also killed during the Holocaust, so only their mother survived the war, and she was left with only a daughter-in-law and a granddaughter, but she, of course, was a broken woman. So again, to refer to Sherry's remark in the beginning, it's often the mothers and the women who share the load of the loss of these men, sons, brothers, and other relatives.
And perhaps the final form of resistance, Jews in and outside of Belgium were also spies, agents, and soldiers. Perhaps the most infamous spy network in Belgium where Jews were very much involved is a Red Orchestra, the Rote Kapelle, which was a communist intelligence group active in Belgium under Leopold Trepper. Many of its, actually almost half of its agents were Jews, communist activists. And it was instrumental in supplying information about German movements and even predicted the German invasion of the Soviet Union. But Jews were also active throughout the occupation as Allied agents. In our database, for instance, we have 35 persons which were recognized post-war as actions and intelligence agents from French, British intelligence. Jews outside of Belgium also became active in other resistance groups outside of Belgium's national borders. So in the beginning of the war, many Belgian Jews fled to France, where a couple of thousand remained during the war. They went there in hiding, and some of them joined French resistance cells. Some of them even managed to get to England and joined the Allied forces. They became volunteers in the RAF or volunteers in the Allied army. For instance, Salomon Nuremberg, born in Krakow and a jeweler in Antwerp, volunteered in the British Army and took part in the campaigns in North Africa, in El Alamein, in Normandy, and further in Germany and the Alsace. Belgian Jews with Belgian nationality didn't have to volunteer because they were called to arms in Belgium. On the right, you see Jean Bloch, who took part in the campaign against the German forces in 1940 as an intelligence officer in the Belgian army. He took part of the defense of Dunkirk and managed to retreat with the British troops to Britain, where he became instrumental in organizing the Belgian forces in Britain. Later, he took part in the Normandy campaign, and he was one of the first who liberated the city of Brussels in the Brigade Piron. So just to see, we have tried to really briefly sum up very different aspects of how Jews in and outside of Belgium, resisted and fought against the Nazi occupation and broader the fascist movement in Europe in the Second World War. There's a lot more to say, but we were restricted in time. So please ask us any questions, should you have them. Thank you very much. Voilà.
Thank you very much, Yaniv and Doreen. Very rich presentation. I think we've all learned a lot. There are nevertheless some questions from our guests who are online. My understanding is that there were quite a few questions, as we can understand, for Dr. Perelman's Matisse. So just to let people know that those questions will be responded to, passed on to her and responded to after the event. Unfortunately, she's not with us in person today. But a perfect segue into the person who asked the first question. It's actually Olivia Matisse, who is Dr. Perelman Matisse's daughter. And so she is asking, how could she get a copy of the resistance files of her grandparents, Haim and Fela Perelman? And just to say that we do have quite a lot of questions about archives, memories. So would you please respond briefly to that question for Dr. Matisse's daughter?
Yes,
okay, no, you go, Doreen.
Yeah, okay. So there's different organizations in Belgium that have different types of files, but we actually saw the files of Professor Perelman and his wife. They're at the military archive in Evere. So I would recommend, if people have specific questions about their family members and where to ask for copies of files of them, to just email Caserne Dossin, and we can tailor-make, do a search for you and tell you where to go, because it's not that easy. It's a federal country and there's a lot of services involved. So we can answer for Mrs. Matisse that it will be in Evere, but there's maybe also other places she can look. And for other people, it will be other places. So there's a broad variety of archival institutions that we should address.
Yeah, as
Thank you.
Says, it's really dependent also on which resistance movement they joined, where the archives are. So it's a complex archival landscape in Belgium.
So I think you might have answered the second question as well, which we have from Lise Marlowe, who's the director of the Holocaust Museum in Philadelphia. She mentioned that she worked with a survivor whose mother was in the Belgium underground. Her name was Rochelle Goldschmidt, and she hid her children and others in convents and other places. And how could she find out more about her role? So I'm assuming that it would be a similar answer to get in touch with you. So we would share your contact details. Another question from Mustafa Marharvi. He said, how can we ensure that the stories of Jewish resistance in Belgium are preserved and passed on to future generations? I'm not sure. Would you like to take that, Doreen, perhaps?
Yes, of course. So a very important thing to know is that the federal institutions in Belgium are working on a website where all the names of the resistance fighters, both Jewish and non-Jewish, are being listed. So this is an ongoing project, and they just recently launched the first section of their website, which is on the resistance fighters that were recognized for acts of espionage, and they will add resistance fighters from other categories. Despite that, in the past, some of the resistance fighters have, of course, been interviewed. Kazarem Dossai, for example, has a collection of about 1,400 interviews of Holocaust survivors, as well as resistance fighters, both Jewish and non-Jewish. And we also have quite some archives of resistance fighters, Jewish resistance fighters. So together with institutions such as the Jewish Museum in Brussels, but also the European Holocaust Research Infrastructure, which tries to bring to light as many testimonies and archives as possible. We try to focus on capturing the stories and then, of course, sharing them.
If I might quickly jump in
Please.
there, one of the prerequisites to telling a story is indeed archives and pictures, any documentation. So also a very warm call here, should you have family members who still hold documents, who still have information, do also please contact, for instance, Kazerne Dossai or other institutions. It's really important that, to tell a story, it needs to be researched, it needs to be available. So if you have documentation, even just nowadays, people can take a digital copy, you can keep the originals, but please do contact us, and perhaps it can be part of the collection, and then in the future people can work with it and bring these stories to light.
Thank you, Yaniv. I think that that's a really important thing to remind everybody of. So we just have a couple of minutes left. If people do have questions, I see some people have their hands raised, please do put them in the Q&A. We'll try and get to a couple more if we can. So we have a question from Judith Van Praag asking if there's a connection with the World Federation for Jewish Holocaust Survivors and Descendants that was formerly known as the Hidden Child Foundation. And whether yes or no, she's asking if you will collaborate or present at the WFJS&D, so I think that's the acronym for the World Federation for Jewish Holocaust Survivors and Descendants, in Paris in 2025. Is that a yes, Doreen?
Doreen, hidden children is really your thing, so I'll leave this.
So yes, we are aware of the existence of the organization. As Kazerne Dossai, we are closely working together with the Hidden Child Foundation in Belgium. We did not really tap into their archives for this research, but it's a very good suggestion. And if we would be invited to present the research at the conference in Paris, we'd be very happy to do so. But until so far, we did not receive an invitation. But we were willing to come to Paris. It's always nice to visit Paris.
Thank you, Doreen. There is one last question that I really would like to have a very brief answer to, because it's an interesting question from Chris Clancy, the Holocaust Center of New Zealand. She's asking, she might have misunderstood, but it seems like most of the Jewish resistance was by naturalized Belgian Jews who moved from Eastern Europe to Belgium. Why do you think it was like this? If you could just answer in sort of 30 seconds, I would very much appreciate it.
Well, it wasn't by naturalized, because also only 10% of the Jewish population at the start of the Second World War had Belgian citizenship. So mostly it was done by immigrants, immigrant Jews who lived here for quite a while, late 1920s, some of them, especially the Germans and the Austrians, from the 1930s. So mostly it was immigrants, which is one of the reasons why it's also perhaps more difficult for Jews to find their way in the Belgian landscape, except for from the Communist Party, where nationalities were downplayed. And so it was not naturalized Belgian citizens, but immigrants mostly, 90% immigrants.
Thank you, Yaniv. And as I say, I just wanted to get to that question, even if we go over a little bit, maybe by a minute. I want to thank both of you very much. I want to thank Ambassador Kridelka for joining us today, Dr. Parlin Matisse for her very moving remarks, and Yaniv and Doreen. And thank you to all of you for joining us today for this really fascinating and enriching discussion. And just let me say personally, what an honor and a pleasure it has been to be with you this afternoon for this very important event. So thank you, everybody, and enjoy the day or the evening, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you.